I watched my mother-in-law sneer at the wildflowers I'd picked from my family's farm. The difference between you and your mother, she told me, sipping champagne paid for by my husband's new CEO salary, is that she was thrown out of a dirt shack and you're being thrown out of a mansion. Sign the divorce papers, sweetie. My husband smirked, handing me a fake psychiatric evaluation he planned to use to take my son. He told me his corporate world was simply getting too big for a clueless housewife. He didn't know that my mother's dirt shack actually owned 68% of his company, and he certainly didn't know I was about to let him embezzle $3 million before I locked the trap. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. Please like this video, subscribe, and let me know which state you're listening from. Let's get into the story. The dining room smelled of roasted garlic, expensive Cabernet, and an overwhelming sense of unearned pride. David sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He had been the chief executive officer for exactly 32 days. He wore his new title the way a child wears a superhero cape, constantly making sure everyone in the room noticed it. He swirled his wine-holding quart about market shares and restructuring plans, while I quietly refilled his water glass. Across from him sat my mother-in-law, Barbara. She had placed her cream-colored Prada tote on the empty chair beside her, treating it with more reverence than she treated anyone in this house. She wore a silk blouse and a pearl necklace that she adjusted every time she laughed at one of David's terrible jokes. "It's just a different tier of leadership," David was saying, leaning back in his chair. "When you're at the top, you have to cut the dead weight. It's my company now. I set the vision." He didn't own the company. He was merely appointed to run it. But 32 days was apparently enough time for him to rewrite reality. I set the serving platter of lobster risotto in the center of the table. Barbara stopped adjusting her pearls. Her eyes drifted from the expensive seafood down to the center of the table. I had arranged a small, simple bouquet of wildflowers I picked from the edges of the property that morning, yellow asters and white yarrow. She offered a smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, carefully practiced for country club luncheons. "Oh, sweetie," Barbara said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Did you pull these weeds from the side of the highway? We could have ordered proper orchids. David makes more than enough now to afford a florist." "I like them," I said evenly. "They remind me of the farm." Barbara let out a soft, breathy sigh. She looked at David, then back at me, tilting her head with an expression of profound pity. "Well, you certainly come by it naturally," Barbara said, reaching for her wineglass. "It's a tragedy, really. Poor thing. Your mother spent her entire life digging in the dirt and smelling like fertilizer, only to get beaten and thrown out by her own husband. A woman with no refinement always ends up discarded." The dining room went entirely silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. My mother, Martha, had fled a violent marriage 30 years ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and me in her arms. She had worked until her hands bled to buy her first acre of land. She was the strongest person I had ever known. And this woman sitting at my dining table, whose greatest achievement was marrying a dentist, was reducing her survival to a joke. I looked at David. I waited for my husband to speak. I waited for him to set a boundary to defend the family he married into. David cleared his throat, picked up his fork, and looked at his plate. "Mom, the risotto is getting cold." He chose his peace over my dignity. He always did. I did not yell. I did not throw my wine in Barbara's perfectly powdered face. Women like Barbara feed on explosive reactions because it proves their theory that you are unstable. Instead, I stood up. I walked calmly to Barbara's side of the table. I picked up her full plate of lobster risotto. "Evelyn, what are you doing?" Barbara asked, her fake smile faltering. "I completely forgot." I said, my voice perfectly level. "You have a severe allergy to anything lacking refinement, Barbara. Let me get you a glass of tap water instead." I carried the expensive seafood back into the kitchen and dropped it straight into the garbage disposal. I hit the switch. The grinding noise was loud, mechanical, and deeply satisfying. When I returned to the dining room, David shot me a glare. "Evelyn, don't start." She didn't mean anything by it. "I'm not starting anything, David," I replied, taking my seat. "I'm just keeping the dead weight off the table. Like you said." The rest of the dinner was eaten in tense, fragile silence. Barbara left shortly after dessert, clutching her Prada bag like a shield, muttering something about the lack of hospitality. David didn't even say goodnight to me. He poured himself another glass of wine and walked straight into his home office, shutting the door firmly behind him. I stayed in the kitchen. I washed the crystal glasses. I wiped down the marble counters until they shined. I functioned on autopilot because if I stopped moving, the anger waiting right behind my ribs was going to break something. At 10 o'clock, I gathered the trash bags to take them out to the garage. The air in the garage was cool and smelled faintly of motor oil. I tossed the first bag into the large bin. As I reached for the second, I heard a voice. It was coming from inside David's Audi Q7. The driver's side door was cracked open. The interior light was off, but I could see the faint blue glow of the Bluetooth dashboard screen. He was sitting in the driver's seat talking on the phone. I froze. I didn't step forward. I just stood in the shadows by the recycling bins and listened. "I know, baby, I know." David's voice echoed softly in the quiet garage. His tone was entirely different from the arrogant CEO at the dinner table. It was smooth, placating, intimate. "You just have to be patient. I'm handling it." A pause. A woman's voice murmured through the car speakers, too muffled for me to catch the exact words, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was a complaint, an impatient demand. "Look, she has no idea." David laughed. It was a cruel, dismissive sound. "She's just a clueless housewife. She spends her days picking weeds and cooking. She doesn't understand how corporate structures work." My grip on the plastic trash bag tightened until it stretched thin. "Just give me a few more weeks to finish the restructuring." David continued, lowering his voice. "Once the new budget is approved, the VP chair is yours, Chloe. I promise. The country bumpkin will be gone soon enough." Chloe, his director of marketing. The woman who had been leaving overly cheerful comments on his LinkedIn posts for the last 6 months. I stood in the dark garage, breathing in the smell of dry earth lingering on my own clothes from the wildflowers I picked that morning. David thought he was a king. He thought he had outgrown me, outgrown my family, and that he could simply discard me the way his mother said women like me get discarded. He didn't know the truth. He didn't know that the CEO chair he was currently sitting in was essentially rented furniture. I quietly set the second trash bag on the concrete floor. I turned around, walked back inside the house, and locked the door to the kitchen. I didn't cry. I walked upstairs to the guest bedroom, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I rarely used. It rang twice. "Farm office," a gruff voice answered. "Arthur," I said, staring at my reflection in the dark window pane. "It's Evelyn. I need to see the corporate ledgers." David left his leather portfolio on the kitchen island the next morning. It was a careless mistake. He was usually meticulous about his newly printed CEO documents, but he had rushed out the door before 7, leaving behind the faint smell of his expensive cologne and a half-empty coffee mug. I put on a pair of jeans, threw my hair into a clip, and drove to the corporate park. The receptionist on the 12th floor, a young woman named Sarah, smiled brightly when the elevator doors opened. "Mrs. Vance, it's so good to see you," she said, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "David is in a meeting right now, but you can head straight back to his office." "Thank you, Sarah," I said. "I'll just leave this on his desk." The executive suite was lined with heavy frosted glass. The door to the CEO's office was cracked open just a fraction of an inch. I raised my hand to push it wide, but my fingers stopped inches from the wood. Through the narrow gap, I had a clear view of David's mahogany desk. He wasn't in a meeting. He was sitting in his high-backed leather chair. Chloe, the director of marketing, was sitting on the edge of his desk. She was leaning down, her hand resting intimately on the back of his neck, laughing at something he had just whispered. David's hand was resting squarely on her thigh. I didn't gasp. I didn't push the door open and demand an explanation. I stood perfectly still in the carpeted hallway. I watched them for exactly 10 seconds, gathering the reality of the situation, locking it away in my mind. Then I turned around, walked over to his executive assistant's empty desk, set the leather portfolio down, and walked back to the elevator. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the initial shock had hardened into something cold and sharp. The house was empty. Leo was at school. I walked straight upstairs to David's study. He had an old iPad he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk. He rarely used it anymore, preferring his new company laptop, but I knew it was still synced to his personal iCloud account. I pulled it out. The battery was at 14%. I plugged it in, waited for the screen to brighten, and typed in the passcode. Leo's birth year. It unlocked immediately. I opened his email app. I didn't have to dig deep. The arrogance of a man who thinks he is untouchable is that he stops covering his tracks. The first flag was an email from a luxury real estate broker in the Pearl District. Subject: closing documents, penthouse 4B. I tapped the screen. There was a PDF attachment. I opened it and zoomed in on the purchasing details. A $1.2 million condominium. The buyer listed was a Shell LLC, but the routing number attached to the wire transfer belonged to our company's discretionary expansion fund. He had used the corporate account to buy it, and the secondary name listed for the building's security access, Chloe Mercer. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, rhythmic thud. He wasn't just cheating. He was embezzling. He was stealing from the very foundation my mother had secretly bled to rebuild, using it to play sugar daddy to his marketing director. I took a screenshot. I opened a new, secure Proton Mail account I had created the night before and emailed the image to myself. I kept scrolling. I should have stopped, but the instinct to survive demands that you map the entire minefield. 2 weeks down in the inbox, I found a thread with an email address I didn't recognize. The signature block belonged to a Dr. Eris Thorne, a private psychiatrist in downtown Portland. Subject: psychological profile strategy. I read David's message. I'm laying the groundwork, Doc. We need to move fast before I file the divorce papers. As we discussed, her mother was a battered woman. Farm trash who ran away from an abusive drunk. The trauma is generational. Evelyn has been showing signs of severe erratic behavior lately. She's unstable. We can easily paint her as an unfit mother. I'm not losing custody of Leo to a clueless housewife. Get the preliminary assessment ready. The air left my lungs. It felt as though the floor had dropped entirely out from under the house. The infidelity was a betrayal of our marriage. The embezzlement was a betrayal of the company. But this was a declaration of war. He was weaponizing the deepest, most painful trauma of my mother's life. He was going to use the scars of the woman who had secretly handed him his entire career to drag me through the mud of family court. He planned to strip me of my child, leave me with nothing, and move his mistress into a $1 million condo bought with my family's money. I didn't throw the iPad against the wall. I didn't scream. Screaming is for people who feel powerless. I took screenshots of every single email in that thread. I forwarded the entire chain to my secure account. Then I closed the apps, cleared the background cache, unplugged the iPad, and placed it exactly where I had found it, in the bottom drawer. I walked down the hall to Leo's bedroom. It smelled like clean laundry and the faint, sweet scent of cedar pencils. His bed was unmade, a small stuffed bear tangled in the blue sheets. I stood in the doorway, my hands resting on the wooden frame. I am not losing Leo. The thought wasn't a panic. It was a concrete wall. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the text thread with Arthur, the chief accountant whom I had called the night before. Arthur. I typed, my thumbs moving with absolute precision. I found the real estate purchase. It's worse than we thought. He's going for custody. Assemble the audit team. But do not strike yet. I want him to sign the divorce papers first. I want him to commit to the fraud. I hit send. The screen glowed briefly in the quiet hallway, then faded to black. David thought he was playing chess against a clueless housewife. He was about to find out he was playing against the owner of the board. I dropped Leo off at elementary school at exactly 8 in the morning. I watched him walk through the double glass doors, his oversized backpack bouncing against his shoulders, until he was completely out of sight. Then, I got back into my car and merged onto Interstate 5, heading south toward the Willamette Valley. I drove for 3 hours. The manicured lawns and gated driveways of Portland's wealthy suburbs gradually gave way to open sky, dense pine borders, and the heavy, fertile smell of damp earth. My mother's property spanned 400 acres of organic soybeans, corn, and specialty rotational crops. From the main county road, it looked exactly like what Barbara, my mother-in-law, thought it was: a sprawling, dirty working farm. There was a rusted John Deere tractor parked near the front gate. The main farmhouse was a simple white wraparound structure that hadn't been painted in 10 years. I didn't park at the farmhouse. I drove the gravel path around back past the main silos to a refurbished barn made of thick, weather-beaten cedar. I parked, stepped out into the crisp morning air, and walked to the heavy oak door at the side of the building. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner disguised beneath a brass plate. The heavy lock clicked. I pulled the oak door open. The smell of dirt vanished, replaced immediately by the sterile metallic scent of ozone and the low, steady hum of cooling fans. The interior of the barn was climate-controlled. The walls were reinforced. At the center of the room sat a massive desk surrounded by 3 curved monitors, a Bloomberg terminal, and a secure server rack quietly blinking in the dim light. This was the nerve center of the family trust, the entity that had quietly bought out David's failing supply chain company 5 years ago and pumped $30 million into its restructuring. My mother was already inside. She was standing at an industrial stainless steel sink in the corner, wearing faded denim overalls and a flannel shirt. She scrubbed her hands with pumice soap, washing away the dark, rich topsoil from her morning soil checks. At 60 years old, Martha had silver hair tied in a practical knot, shoulders built by decades of labor, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She dried her hands on a rough towel and turned to look at me. She didn't ask why I was there. Arthur sent me the preliminary flags on the expansion fund at 6 a.m. She said, her voice gravelly and calm. $3 million routed through a shell LLC to purchase real estate in the Pearl District, and a series of suspicious legal retainers. I stood by the servers, my hands tucked into my jacket pockets so she wouldn't see them shaking. He's buying a condo for his marketing director, and he's hiring a psychiatrist to build a fake profile on me so he can take Leo in the divorce. My mother didn't gasp. She didn't offer a sympathetic sigh. She walked over to her desk, pulled out the heavy leather chair, and sat down. "I knew about the girl a month ago," she said flatly. I stared at her. The hum of the servers suddenly felt deafening. "You knew, and you still let the board confirm him as CEO last month." "Evelyn," my mother said, leaning forward, "a company this size needs a leader who knows how to sever a rotting limb without hesitating. You have been playing the quiet, supportive housewife for 7 years. You let his mother insult you in your own dining room. You let him take credit for a turnaround that was entirely funded by this farm." She pointed a calloused finger at the polished mahogany desk. "I didn't hand him the CEO chair because he earned it. I handed it to him to see what he would do with absolute power. And more importantly, I needed to see what you would do when he inevitably abused it. I needed to know if you had the stomach to protect what's yours before I handed over the keys to the entire empire." I stopped breathing for a second. The reality of her strategy settled over me like a heavy winter coat. She hadn't been rewarding David. She had been giving him enough rope to hang himself. And she had been testing me. I pulled my hands out of my pockets. They had stopped shaking. "I'm done playing the housewife," I said. "I want to initiate a full forensic audit, and I want to lock the capital accounts." My mother studied my face. For the first time that morning, the hard lines around her mouth softened just a fraction. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small encrypted steel USB drive, and tossed it across the desk. I caught it in one hand. "I cut the tumor out of my life 30 years ago," my mother said, her voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. "I walked away from that man with a bruised face, you in my arms, and nothing else. I built all of this from the dirt up. Now it's your turn. Don't disappoint me." I didn't say another word. I walked around the desk, sat down at the primary terminal, and plugged the steel drive into the secure port. The screen flickered black for a heartbeat. Then a stark white prompt appeared across the center monitor. "Welcome, majority shareholder. Initiate override protocol Y/N." I rested my fingers on the quiet keyboard, looked at the flashing cursor, and pressed Y. I met Arthur at a corner booth in an unassuming diner off Interstate 205. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the dead hour between the lunch rush and the dinner crowd. Arthur was 58, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and had the meticulous, unhurried posture of a man who spent his life translating chaos into spreadsheets. He was the chief financial officer of David's company on paper. In reality, he was my mother's oldest employee, placed there 5 years ago to ensure the family trust's investment was properly managed. He was drinking black coffee when I slid into the booth across from him. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He simply slid a manila folder across the Formica table. "I pulled the entire ledger for the discretionary expansion fund," Arthur said, keeping his voice barely above a murmur. "Your husband has been busy." I opened the folder. The top page was a highlighted bank statement. $3 million transferred over the last 40 days. Arthur continued, tracing a line with his silver pen. "It went into a Shell LLC registered in Delaware, which then purchased the condo in the Pearl District. But that's not all of it." He flipped the page. "He authorized 2 wire transfers yesterday, $40,000 to a high-end family law firm downtown, and a $15,000 retainer to a private psychiatric evaluator." I stared at the numbers printed in stark black ink. It was one thing to read David's emails and know his plan. It was entirely different to look at the math. "He's using your own money," Arthur said, his eyes meeting mine. They were not filled with pity, but with a cold, professional anger. "He is using the capital your mother injected into this company to buy a house for his mistress and to hire the lawyers to destroy you." I closed the folder. The edges of the thick paper cut slightly into my thumb. "When is the next transfer scheduled?" I asked. Arthur checked his watch. "He submitted a request for a final $500,000 draw this morning. He categorized it under international marketing logistics. It's currently pending my approval. I can lock the accounts right now. I can freeze the expansion fund and flag the previous transfers for corporate fraud." "No," I said instantly. Arthur paused. "Evelyn, if that money leaves the account, if we freeze it now, he'll claim it was an administrative error." I interrupted, my voice perfectly steady. "He will hire an aggressive defense attorney and spin it as a corporate restructuring move. He might get off with a fine and a quiet dismissal." I slid the folder back to Arthur. "Approve the transfer," I said. "Let him move the final batch into the Shell LLC." Arthur's eyebrows pulled together. "That brings the total embezzlement to $3.5 million. "Exactly," I said. "In this state, anything over $1 million shifts the crime into a different felony bracket. I don't want him quietly dismissed, Arthur. I want him to steal enough to guarantee a federal sentence." A slow, grim understanding settled over Arthur's face. He picked up his silver pen and slipped it back into his breast pocket. "I will approve the wire transfer at 5 o'clock today," he said quietly. "And I will have the independent audit team ready to strike the moment you give the signal." "Thank you, Arthur," I said. I left the diner and drove back to the suburbs. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns of my neighborhood. I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The trap was set. Now I just had to play my part until the jaws snapped shut. I turned onto my street and pulled into my driveway. The calm vanished instantly. Stacked on the front porch right next to the blue welcome mat I had bought 3 years ago were 6 heavy-duty black contractor bags. They were completely full, tied off at the top with cheap plastic strings. As I stepped out of the car, the front door opened. Barbara stepped out onto the porch. She was holding my favorite beige cashmere sweater in one hand, looking at it with a sneer of absolute disgust before tossing it carelessly onto the concrete steps. David was standing right behind her, holding a thick stack of legal documents. My 72-hour countdown hadn't even begun, and they were already throwing me out like trash. I stood on the front porch and stared at the 6 heavy-duty contractor bags. One of them had torn slightly near the top, exposing the sleeve of my winter coat. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The entryway smelled of Barbara's expensive gardenia perfume. She was standing near the hall closet holding a stack of my wooden hangers as if they were contaminated. "Don't track dirt on the rugs, Evelyn," Barbara said, not looking up. "I've already called the cleaning service for tomorrow morning. This house needs a deep sanitization." I walked past her into the living room. David was sitting on the center cushion of our custom leather sofa. His posture was perfectly relaxed, one ankle resting on his knee. Spread out on the glass coffee table in front of him was a thick stack of legal documents neatly tabbed with yellow sticky notes. "Sit down," David said. It wasn't an invitation. It was an order from a CEO to a subordinate. I sat on the edge of the accent chair opposite him. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, deliberately making my shoulders look small. "I'm filing for divorce," David said smoothly. He tapped the thickest stack of paper. "These are the preliminary settlement terms. I've already signed them. You're going to sign them today." I looked at the documents, keeping my expression entirely blank. "And what are the terms?" "You get out," David replied, leaning forward. "You take your personal belongings, which my mother has generously packed for you, and you leave. You don't get alimony. You don't touch my company's assets. And most importantly, I am taking full primary custody of Leo." My fingernails dug into the palms of my hands. "You can't do that," I whispered, injecting exactly the right amount of panic into my voice. "Leo is my son. No judge will take him from me." David smiled. It was a terrible, patient smile. He pulled a slim manila envelope from the bottom of the stack and slid it across the glass. "Dr. Thorne is a highly respected psychiatrist," David said. "His preliminary evaluation, based on my detailed reports of your recent behavior, indicates severe emotional instability. You have a documented family history of generational trauma, Evelyn. Your mother is a deeply damaged woman. The court will see that you are unraveling just like her. If you fight me on this, I will drag your mental health through a public courtroom. I will make sure you only see Leo under supervised visitation for the rest of his childhood." He sat back, letting the threat settle in the quiet room. He was offering me a choice: walk away quietly with nothing, or fight and have my child legally ripped from my arms by a fabricated medical file. Barbara walked into the living room, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. She stood behind David's shoulder, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. "It's really for the best," Barbara said, using her sweetest, most venomous tone. "Leo needs a stable environment. He needs a family with proper breeding. You were always just a visitor here, Evelyn. The difference between you and your mother is, she was thrown out of a dirt shack, and you're being thrown out of $1 million mansion. Sign it, sweetie. Don't make this uglier than it has to be." I looked at Barbara. Then I looked at David. I let my lower lip tremble. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let the genuine horror of what they were trying to do fuel the tears that suddenly spilled over my eyelashes. "Please," I sobbed, letting my voice crack. I buried my face in my hands, shoulders shaking. Please, David, don't take him from me. I have nowhere to go. I don't have any money. Just, just give me a few days. Let me figure out an apartment. Let me explain it to Leo. David exchanged a look with his mother. I watched them through the gaps in my fingers. He looked disgusted but deeply satisfied. The mighty CEO had broken the clueless housewife. 3 days, David said, his voice dripping with magnanimity. You have 72 hours to find a cheap rental and get the rest of your garbage out of my house. I'll have my lawyer draft the final waiver of financial discovery. Since you're agreeing not to contest the assets, we can skip the forensic accounting and push the custody agreement through a private mediator. Thank you, I choked out, wiping my face with a trembling hand. Thank you, David. Don't thank me, he said coldly. Just pack. Tay. I stood up, keeping my head bowed, and hurried out of the living room. I practically ran up the stairs, my footsteps heavy and frantic, exactly the way a broken woman would run. I walked into the master bathroom and shut the heavy wooden door behind me. I turned the deadbolt. Click. I walked over to the double vanity. I turned on the cold water, cupped it in my hands, and splashed it over my face. The cool water washed away the tear tracks. I reached for a thick cotton towel and patted my skin dry. When I lowered the towel and looked in the mirror, the terrified, sobbing housewife was completely gone. My hands were perfectly steady. My breathing was slow and measured. David had just handed me exactly what I needed. By using the fake psychological evaluation to terrify me, he thought he had avoided a financial audit. He had just confessed in front of witnesses that he was trying to hide his assets. The 72-hour countdown hadn't started for my eviction. It had started for his destruction. I spent Thursday morning packing the things that actually mattered. I didn't care about the designer dresses hanging in my closet or the expensive kitchen appliances David had bought to showcase our wealth to his colleagues. Let Barbara pack those into her black plastic bags. Instead, I sat on the floor of Leo's room with a single sturdy cardboard box. I packed his baby book. I packed the handmade wooden train set my mother had carved for his 3rd birthday. I carefully wrapped the framed photographs of him playing in the dirt at the farm. I was removing the soul of my family from this house, leaving behind only the expensive empty shell. At 1 o'clock, David left for the downtown Marriott. He was hosting the corporate restructuring gala the following evening, and he insisted on personally approving the lighting arrangements and the catering menu. He wanted the event to be flawless. It was the night he planned to unveil his new era to the board of directors, and more importantly, the night he planned to publicly elevate Chloe to vice president. He had walked out the front door in a custom charcoal suit, leaving his silver company laptop sitting on the kitchen island. I won't need it for a food tasting, he had said, waving a dismissive hand. Just make sure it's packed in my overnight bag by tomorrow. The moment his Audi pulled out of the driveway, I locked the front door. I walked into the kitchen, opened the silver laptop, and inserted my encrypted USB drive. I didn't need his password. The machine was already logged into the corporate network via the home Wi-Fi. I opened his hidden local folders. I began copying everything. The final drafts of his divorce strategy. The email threads with his lawyer discussing how to hide the Delaware LLC. The finalized psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Thorne, which was nothing more than a fiction built on my mother's real pain. A small dialog box appeared on the screen. Copying 1,402 files. Estimated time 4 minutes. I stood perfectly still in the quiet kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. The wall clock ticked. 2 minutes remaining. I tapped my fingernail lightly against the marble countertop. 1 minute remaining. Then I heard it. The heavy, unmistakable crunch of tires pulling sharply onto the gravel driveway. My breath caught in my throat. I looked out the kitchen window. The Audi was back. David threw the car into park and stepped out, holding his phone to his ear, looking annoyed. He walked briskly toward the front porch. I looked at the screen. 45 seconds remaining. The deadbolt rattled. He was putting his key in the lock. 30 seconds. The front door swung open. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hardwood entryway. Evelyn. David called out, his voice sharp and impatient. Where is the Marriott vendor contract? I swear I left it in the study. 15 seconds. His footsteps were moving toward the hallway. He would pass the kitchen archway in less than 10 seconds. 5 seconds. The green bar hit the edge of the window. Copy complete. I grabbed the metal base of the USB drive and yanked it out of the port. I shoved it deep into the front pocket of my jeans just as David walked through the archway. I quickly closed the laptop lid and turned around, grabbing a roll of packing tape off the island. David stopped. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. What are you doing with my laptop? I was just moving it. I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering violently against my ribs. You said you wanted it in your overnight bag. I was clearing the counter to pack the tape. He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then his shoulders relaxed. The suspicion in his eyes melted back into his usual comfortable arrogance. He didn't see a corporate threat. He only saw a discarded housewife fulfilling a chore. Right, David said. He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. The vendor contract is in my study. I have to get back downtown. He walked over to the island and picked up the laptop. As he turned to leave, he paused. He looked at the roll of packing tape in my hand, then at the empty kitchen around us. His expression shifted into something resembling pity. It was almost worse than his cruelty. Evelyn, he said softly, using the tone one might use to soothe a frightened dog. Don't look at me like that. This isn't about you doing anything wrong. You're a good mother. But my world is just expanding. You don't fit into the new architecture. Please don't blame me for outgrowing this. I stood there, feeling the cold metal of the USB drive pressing against my leg through the denim of my jeans. It held the evidence of his felonies, his lies, and his imminent destruction. I looked at the man I had married 7 years ago, and I felt absolutely nothing. Your world is certainly expanding, David, I said quietly. I just hope you have the capacity to hold on to it. He offered a sad, patronizing smile. I'll be fine. Have your things out by Sunday. He walked out the door. I listened to his car back out of the driveway and speed away down the street. I walked upstairs to the guest room, locked the door, and pulled my phone from my back pocket. I opened my encrypted email app and typed a single brief message to Arthur. I have everything. Initiate the full forensic audit at exactly 8 p.m. tomorrow night. I hit send. The trap was locked. The grand ballroom of the downtown Marriott was bathed in the warm golden glow of 3 massive crystal chandeliers. David had spared no expense. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of seared scallops and flutes of vintage Dom Perignon. The room was filled with regional directors, key investors, and the upper echelon of Portland's corporate society. It was exactly the kind of room David had always believed he belonged in. Near the center of the room, holding court by a towering ice sculpture, was Barbara. She was wearing a $5,000 midnight blue silk gown. I knew the exact price because I had seen the charge on the corporate expansion ledger Arthur gave me. She laughed a high musical sound as she leaned in to speak to a circle of wealthy wives. Oh, it was a long time coming, Barbara said, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. David is a visionary. He simply couldn't have a wife who didn't understand the demands of his world. You have to prune the dead branches for the tree to thrive, don't you? One of the women, the wife of a logistics VP, leaned in with hungry curiosity. Is she contesting the divorce? I heard she had nowhere to go. Barbara offered a smile of profound manufactured pity. She has no resources, Barbara whispered loud enough for the entire circle to hear. She's probably crying in some cheap motel room right now, trying to figure out how to pay for groceries. It's sad, really. But I told David from the start, this family doesn't harbor trash. A light smattering of polite, cruel laughter rippled through the group. At the front of the room, a soft chime sounded over the audio system. The low murmur of conversations faded as David walked up the carpeted steps to the acrylic podium. He looked magnificent. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection. Standing just a few feet away from the stage, watching him with an expression of pure adoration, was Chloe. She was wearing a stunning emerald dress, already looking the part of the newly minted vice president. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice deep and resonant through the microphone. "5 years ago, this company was struggling to find its identity. Tonight, we stand at the precipice of a new era, an era built on aggressive expansion, relentless innovation, and a self-made vision." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I built this restructuring plan from the ground up." He continued, placing a hand over his heart. "And I couldn't have done it without the brilliant minds on my executive team. Specifically, our director of marketing, Chloe Mercer, who will be stepping into a much larger role in the coming weeks." The room broke into polite applause. David smiled down at Chloe. Barbara beamed from the center of the room, raising her glass toward her son. They were kings and queens of a castle they had stolen. They had no idea that the drawbridge was already coming down. Outside the hotel, the crisp evening air was suddenly cut by the sound of heavy tires against the valet driveway. A sleek black armored SUV pulled up to the curb, bypassing the line of waiting luxury cars. The valet rushed forward, but before he could reach the handle, the rear door pushed open. I stepped out onto the pavement. I wasn't wearing a floral housewife dress or a cashmere sweater. I was wearing a sharply tailored slate gray blazer, dark trousers, and black leather stilettos. My hair was pulled back into a severe, polished twist. The door on the opposite side opened. My mother stepped out into the city lights. Martha did not look like a woman who spent her days digging in the dirt. She wore a flawless, custom-fitted black pantsuit that commanded absolute authority. Her silver hair was immaculate. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who owned a $30 million empire. Behind us, a second vehicle pulled up. Arthur stepped out, clutching a thick black leather briefcase. He was flanked by 3 men in dark suits, the independent forensic auditors and the head of corporate security. We didn't wait for the valet. We didn't speak. We walked through the sliding glass doors of the lobby, our footsteps moving in perfect lethal unison across the marble floors. The hotel staff took one look at the security team and stepped aside. We reached the long corridor leading to the grand ballroom. I could hear David's voice echoing through the heavy wooden doors, talking about integrity and the future. I stopped in front of the brass handles. I looked at my mother. Martha gave me a single slow nod. I reached out, gripped both handles, and pushed the heavy double doors wide open. They hit the wall stoppers with a loud echoing crack. The light jazz playing softly in the background screeched to a halt. 200 heads turned simultaneously toward the entrance. David stopped mid-sentence. His hand froze on the edges of the acrylic podium. The silence in the room was absolute. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. 200 people holding crystal flutes of champagne stared at the open doorway. The only sound in the massive room was the sharp, rhythmic click, click, click of my stilettos as I walked down the center aisle. My mother walked to my right, her posture impeccable. Arthur walked to my left. The corporate security team fanned out immediately, 2 men taking positions at the main doors while the head of security followed us toward the stage. David stood frozen at the acrylic podium. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving him a pale, sickly gray under the stage lights. As I reached the front row of tables, the shock wore off, and David's arrogance desperately tried to reassert itself. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning into the microphone. "Evelyn, what the hell is this?" David demanded, his voice echoing loudly, though a slight tremor betrayed his panic. He looked past me to the hotel staff. "Security, get this woman out of here. This is a private corporate event." I didn't stop. I walked up the 3 carpeted steps onto the stage. Chloe, standing just a few feet away, took a step back, her eyes wide, as she looked at the men in dark suits surrounding the perimeter. I stopped directly in front of David. I reached out and calmly pulled the microphone down to my level. "You're right, David," I said, my voice echoing evenly across the silent ballroom. "It is a private corporate event, which is exactly why the majority shareholder is here." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Investors and regional directors exchanged confused glances. "What are you talking about?" David hissed, stepping toward me. "You've lost your mind. Arthur, call the police." Arthur didn't call the police. He walked over to the AV technician's table at the edge of the stage, handed the man a flash drive, and pointed at the massive projection screen behind David. The screen blinked. The corporate logo vanished. In its place, projected in massive letters for the entire ballroom to see, was a bank ledger. Highlighted in bright yellow was a wire transfer of $3 million from the company's expansion fund to a Delaware LLC. Below it was the deed to the Pearl District penthouse. Listed under the LLC was David's signature. Listed as the property resident was Chloe Mercer. A collective gasp swept through the room. Chloe physically stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. David turned around to look at the screen. His shoulders visibly slumped. The confident, self-made visionary evaporated, leaving behind a terrified thief caught in the spotlight. "That's," David stammered, turning back to the crowd. He was sweating now. "That's a restructuring allocation. It's perfectly legal." "It is corporate fraud," I interrupted, my voice cutting through his lie like glass. "And as the manager of the family trust that owns 68% of this company, I am officially terminating your employment effective immediately." Suddenly, a high-pitched, furious voice shrieked from the center of the ballroom. "How dare you?" Barbara pushed her way through the crowd of stunned executives. Her face was flushed dark red, the veins in her neck bulging. The carefully crafted mask of the wealthy socialite was completely gone, replaced by pure, ugly rage. She marched to the edge of the stage, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You filthy, lying farm trash!" Barbara screamed. "You forged those documents. You're just a bitter, dumped housewife trying to ruin my son's night. You have no power here." My mother stepped forward. Martha looked down at Barbara from the edge of the stage. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. True power never raises its voice. Martha reached into her blazer, pulled out the certified articles of incorporation, and dropped them onto the front table. They hit the wood with a heavy thud. "Barbara," my mother said. Her gravelly voice carried perfectly across the dead silent room. "That dress you are wearing cost $5,000. The catering for this party cost $40,000. Your son's car, his salary, and the very ground you are standing on right now were paid for by the family trust I built." Barbara stared at the documents. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "This company," my mother continued, her eyes locked onto Barbara's terrified face, "was bought and saved with corn and soybean money. Everything your son claims to have built and everything you are wearing belongs to this farmer." Barbara looked around the room. The circle of wealthy wives she had been bragging to just 10 minutes ago were now staring at her with undisguised disgust. They were stepping away from her, physically distancing themselves from the fraud. David looked at me, his eyes wide, his chest heaving. "Evelyn, Evelyn, please. Let's talk about this privately. We're a family. We can fix this." "Fix what?" I asked softly, stepping closer to him. "The $3 million you stole. Or the fake psychiatric evaluation you bought with my money to try and steal my son." The murmurs in the crowd turned into loud, angry whispers. Board members were already pulling out their phones, making calls. David turned frantically to Chloe. "Chloe, tell them it was a joint investment." Chloe looked at the screen, then at the corporate security officers. She knew the federal penalties for embezzlement. She dropped her crystal champagne flute onto the stage, It shattered, sending shards of glass across the carpet. Without a single word, Chloe gathered the skirt of her emerald dress, turned around, and practically ran down the side stairs, disappearing through the exit doors. David was completely alone. I looked at the man who had ordered me out of my own home and tried to erase me from my child's life. "Do you think you earned this CEO chair, David?" I said, delivering the words with absolute freezing finality. "No, it was a test my mother set for me, and you just helped me pass it with flying colors. Now hand over your keycard." David stood frozen. He didn't reach for his pocket. The head of corporate security stepped onto the stage. He placed a heavy hand firmly on David's shoulder. "Mr. Vance," the security chief said quietly, "we're going to escort you to the holding office. The authorities are waiting." David's knees buckled slightly as the security guards took him by the arms and led him off the stage. He didn't look back. The illusion of David Vance collapsed the moment the security officers gripped his arms. He didn't walk out with dignity. As they pulled him toward the side exit, his panic finally broke through the paralyzing shock. He dug his expensive leather shoes into the carpet, twisting his shoulders. "It was Chloe!" David shouted, his voice cracking, echoing through the silent ballroom. "She set up the Delaware LLC. She had the routing numbers. Evelyn, you have to listen to me. She manipulated the accounts." I stood on the stage and watched him. 10 minutes ago, he had proudly introduced her as his brilliant vice president. Now, facing federal prison, he was throwing her under the bus without a second thought. The security chief gave a sharp tug, and the heavy side doors closed behind them, cutting off David's frantic screaming. The silence returned, but the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. The wealthy investors and regional directors were already moving. They weren't looking at me, and they certainly weren't looking at Barbara. They were walking briskly toward the main exit, speaking quietly into their phones to their own lawyers and PR teams. Nobody wanted their name attached to a corporate fraud scandal. Barbara stood alone near the front row of tables. The color had completely drained from her face. She looked around, her eyes wide and darting like a trapped animal. She saw a woman in a silver dress hurrying toward the aisle, Helen, the wife of a logistics executive whom Barbara had been drinking champagne with just 20 minutes earlier. Barbara lunged forward, grabbing Helen's forearm. "Helen, please!" Barbara stammered, her voice high and thin. "This is a misunderstanding. David is just... There's a mistake with the paperwork. You know David." Helen stopped. She looked down at Barbara's hand on her arm, her expression perfectly blank. "Let go of me, Barbara," Helen said, her voice dropping to a freezing, polite whisper. "This is a corporate crime scene. Do not call my house." Helen pulled her arm away and walked out the door. Barbara stumbled backward, bumping into an empty chair. She watched her entire social circle, the women she had spent years desperately trying to impress, evaporate in less than 2 minutes. The country club mask was gone. All that was left was a terrified, aging woman in a dress she didn't own. She turned and looked up at me. The rage she had shown just moments ago had completely vanished. Narcissists are incredibly adaptable when they realize they have no leverage left. Her eyes filled with rapid, desperate tears. "Evelyn," Barbara cried, her voice breaking into a pathetic sob. She walked up to the edge of the stage, clasping her hands together. "Evelyn, please. We're family. You know I didn't mean those things I said. I was just upset. David is the father of your child. You can't let them put him in a cage." I stepped down from the stage. I walked until I was standing just a foot away from her. "You were right, Barbara," I said softly. She blinked, a flicker of confused hope crossing her wet face. "What? Earlier today you said I was just like my mother?" I continued, my voice calm, steady, and entirely empty of mercy. "You were absolutely right. We both know exactly how to take out the trash." The hope died in her eyes. Arthur stepped forward. He was holding a sleek black tablet. "Mrs. Vance, Arthur said to me. The asset freeze protocol is ready for your signature. I took the stylus and signed my name across the digital line. It's done, Arthur said, taking the tablet back. He turned to Barbara, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Barbara, the corporate accounts are now locked. That includes the corporate credit card tied to your name and the lease on the Audi SUV you drove here tonight. Security will be impounding the vehicle in the parking garage. I suggest you call a cab. Barbara stared at him, her mouth opening and closing. She looked down at her Prada bag. It was empty of anything that actually belonged to her. My mother walked past Barbara without giving her a single glance. Martha touched my shoulder lightly. Let's go home, Evelyn. The air in here is stale. We walked out of the grand ballroom, leaving Barbara standing entirely alone under the massive crystal chandeliers. I slept perfectly that night. I woke up the next morning in my own bed. The house was quiet. I walked downstairs to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and unlocked my phone. I didn't need to check my secure email. I just opened the local news app. The headline was right at the top, printed in bold, undeniable letters. CEO of Vance Logistics detained in $3 million embezzlement probe. Beneath it was a photograph of David being led out of the Marriott loading dock in handcuffs. His expensive tuxedo jacket rumpled his head, bowed to hide his face from the flashing cameras. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The 72-hour countdown was officially over. It took exactly 1 month to completely erase David's new era from the company. I had the heavy mahogany desk removed from the CEO's office. I replaced it with something lighter made of reclaimed wood from the Willamette Valley. The frosted glass was taken down, letting natural light flood the executive suite for the first time in years. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Arthur walked into my office. He didn't carry a black leather briefcase this time, just a single manila folder. He sat in the chair across from me and smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his strict face. The federal prosecutors officially rejected David's plea deal this morning, Arthur said, resting the folder on his lap. Because he used a shell LLC across state lines to conceal corporate funds, they are pursuing full wire fraud charges. He's looking at 8 to 10 years in a federal facility. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the large window at the Portland skyline. And the condo, seized by the authorities, Arthur replied. Chloe Mercer cleared out her desk the morning after the gala. She hasn't been seen in the city since. As for Barbara, Arthur adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. She was evicted from the mansion last week. The trust reclaimed the property. I understand she is currently renting a 1-bedroom apartment near the airport. She has been calling the corporate office daily demanding to speak with you, but reception has instructions to forward her directly to the legal department's voicemail. Keep it that way, I said. Barbara was a woman who fed on attention, on being seen, on feeling superior. Putting her in a small box where no one would take her calls was a punishment far worse for her than any courtroom could provide. I thanked Arthur, packed up my laptop, and left the office early. The drive down Interstate 5 felt different now. The weight that had been pressing against my chest for the last 7 years was completely gone. When I pulled onto the gravel driveway of my mother's property, the smell of damp earth and pine trees welcomed me like an old friend. I walked around the back of the farmhouse. Out in the garden, bathed in the late afternoon sun, was Leo. He was wearing denim overalls, his knees completely covered in dark, rich topsoil. He was holding a small hand trowel, carefully digging a hole next to the tomato plants. My mother was kneeling beside him. Martha had dirt on her face and a smudge of mud across her forehead. She was showing Leo how to gently separate the roots of a seedling before placing it into the ground. Leo laughed at something she said, a loud, unburdened, joyful sound that echoed across the open fields. I stood by the wooden fence and watched them. This was the dirt that Barbara had so viciously insulted. This was the earth that had bought David his suits, his cars, and his fragile ego. And this was the very same dirt that had saved my life and my son's life when the illusion finally shattered. Martha looked up and saw me standing by the fence. She didn't smile broadly. That wasn't who she was. But she gave me that same slow, steady nod she had given me outside the grand ballroom doors. It was the absolute unspoken confirmation between two women who had walked through the fire and come out holding the keys to the kingdom. People like David and Barbara spend their entire lives trying to make everyone else feel small, believing that cruelty is the same thing as strength. They build their empires on lies, assuming the quiet people in the room are simply too weak to fight back. But you don't need to shout to prove your strength. Real power is when you stay entirely silent and let a fool build his own prison. What about you? What would you have done in my place? Would you have allowed your mother to test you by giving a man like David the CEO chair? Or would you have handled it differently? Let me know in the comments. Share this story, subscribe, and thank you for listening, dear friends.